the tsunami in Japan several years ago. More video, more information about that by people creating media than maybe any event in history. Definitely acts of journalism. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that are definitely journalism, and then we have to ask questions. This is Talking Points memo by a guy named Josh Marshall, who's running it now, but he created this thing as a single person's blog a decade ago, or a little more. And it's now very much part of almost the mainstream of journalism, and it's never existed in print unless someone actually prints out stuff at home or at the office. It's totally on the web, and it's absolutely journalism. Likewise, some new projects that are going on in places like Oakland to try and fill in for what's going missing. This is from Singapore, and let me tell you, in Singapore, which is a dictatorship, it's not so easy to do journalism that challenges the authority. A local thing going on here, Front Page Forum, which I like a lot, is bringing, helping people bring news about their own communities to each other. Then it gets a little different. So this guy, who's a professor, writes a great blog, and it's about paleoanthropology and topics, and he writes beautifully. I happen to be interested in this, so I read his blog. There's no, readable professional publication, and when I say readable, readable by anyone who's not in that business, that I know of, and this guy takes care of it for me. Is he a journalist? Not exactly, but wow, it's about as good as I can find in that area. And then you get into cases that are even harder to figure out. Human Rights Watch, an NGO. What do they do? Think about this for a second. They go out, they do part of the act of journalism, a major part, which is to go out and get information, documents, interviews, all kinds of stuff, and then they put it together in reports. It's media, and it's this close to journalism. I'm increasingly thinking these guys need to be thought of as part of journalism and others, what they're doing. What famous journalism organization has done by far the best reporting, as in gathering and reporting of information about the Guantanamo prison that the United States runs? Well, it's that famous journalism organization, the American Civil Liberties Union. And in the past, the ACLU and others, here's how they got their stuff out to people. They would go persuade someone at the New York Times to write a story about the report that they were going to issue, and almost no one read the report. Now they publish it. They're doing media. They're part of something. People are still trying to figure out what to do about WikiLeaks in terms of whether it's journalism. I consider it to be part of the journalism ecosystem, and a very, very important one. And if we end up, if our country ends up prosecuting WikiLeaks or Assange or whoever, that's high danger territory for the New York Times, because in a substantial way what the New York Times does routinely is the same thing that WikiLeaks is doing. Not the same in its basic stuff, but in terms of how we should identify them in a legal and in some ways a journalistic sense. What I'm getting at is that this is not about journalism as a separate thing from everything else. It's not bloggers or journalists. It's bloggers and journalists. And some bloggers do journalism, some don't, most don't, but that's fine. I'm inclusive, and we're creating an ecosystem, an incredibly diverse ecosystem, of which this is 1/1,000,000th of it, where it ranges everywhere, and this is so wonderful that we're getting into this era of rapid change and rapid diversification in every way that matters. So I'm pretty comfortable that we have ample supply coming along. We're missing some things, I would agree, but a lot of things are happening. The demand worries me a bit, and it was part of what I did my last book about. So much stuff, and a lot of it's garbage. What do we do about that? The question of what we can trust is huge, and we have to be working on that and figuring it out. And we don't know what we can trust in the world of Photoshop and things like it, where we manipulate media and things like this image race around the world. This is a composite created after September 11th, 2001 that went around the internet like crazy and was fast. It was quickly debunked for a lot of very sound reasons. That's not a real picture. It's two pictures. And yet there are probably still people who saw that and think they witnessed something. We have better tools, by the way, in the digital world to help the truth catch up and replace the lies. We don't use them well yet, but we could do it better. And I'm comfortable we could get that right. So we need better stuff, and we need to work on ourselves as consumers of media and become active in a whole bunch of things. I'm going to move on quickly. The biggest change in media for me, and every bit of work I do stems from this, what I'm going to point out here, is that we're moving from the lecture mode of journalism to conversation. News is conversation. Anyone who uses Facebook already knows that, and Twitter and a lot of other things. I'm not saying it's better than what we had. In many cases it's worse, but a lot of it's fundamentally changing, and it changes everybody's perspective when we do it right. What we should be not changing are principles of how we create media if we're going to do it in ways where we want to be trusted. And I'm not talking here about a simple YouTube video, but about the journalistic information process if you want folks to trust you. And the first four of those, every journalist would recognize and nod their head and say, yeah, that's right, of course. But the last one is actually new in journalism. It has not been practiced much, and one I think is pretty crucial. I mean, I've added this actually to the talk because when Vermont Public Radio talked to me, this came up, and I discovered by reading their story that this was what I was talking about tonight. So I'm going to talk about it for just a second. But transparency is really important. We have to be better at this in journalism, and that means to do a few obvious things, like if we have a worldview, say so. Tell people when we make mistakes and correct them fast. And we explain things, and the tools give us more possibility. So you're not looking at someone who believes that objectivity is possible. I think it's nice to try, but come on, we're not going to be objective because we are human. And we can do things, although if you follow that list of principles, I think that's better than objectivity, however we define it. So one way I think about objectivity is the statement of worldview and replacing it anyway. The transparency is, my friend David Weinberger has said, is the new objectivity. I think it's part of it. When I go to London, I buy the Telegraph, which is reliably right of center politically. And I buy the Guardian, which is left of center, also because they pay me to write a column every week. But I read them both. They both do great journalism. They both challenge their own assumptions in their journalism, but they come at it from different parts of the political spectrum. And I read them both, and I think I'm triangulating on some reality that exists in the London infrastructure, the London status quo. Folks, that's sort of where it is. And everyone can do this, and everyone should do stuff like this. And it would be nice if our own organizations would just, the ones that do have a worldview, and a lot of them do pretend they don't, just say so. Transparency is also, admitting loudly when you screw up and doing something about it. So a few years ago, Consumer Reports made a terrible mistake in a long piece about child seats in cars, and it was pretty bad. And so what did they do? Well, they fixed it. They told everyone they had moved. They wrote a long explainer of how it happened. They told you what processes they were putting in place to make sure that particular thing didn't happen again. I parenthetically here, my friend Esther Dyson has a great thing. She says, always make new mistakes. I doubt that Consumer Reports will make that mistake. Great transparency. Another transparency method, by the way, is tell people how you're doing your stuff as journalists. So the New Yorker a few years ago, reporter, he discovers that 2 very similar communities demographically. Same kinds of incomes, other demographics. One spends way more than the other on health care, and the people are less healthy than in the other community. And the reporter says, that's weird. And proceeds to tell us in the story how he went about figuring out what was going on. That's a level of transparency, telling folks how you do it. It's a detective story in part. This doesn't lend itself to everything, but it's a great way to do journalism in a way that people will understand how you're doing it and how hard it is to do it well. I said using the tools of media for journalism is a good idea, and this is just an example. Wikipedia has, behind every article, an archive of everything that changed from the moment that first page was written. Now, I'm not telling you Wikipedia is perfect. I am telling you it's pretty damn great. And by the way, this comes up in universities a lot. Wikipedia is almost always the best place to start, but it's absolutely the worst place to stop in your research. Go to the bottom of any good Wikipedia article and you'll find links to original source material. Follow those if you want to quote something. Don't cite Wikipedia, that's all I say, but start there. And I ran that idea by Jimmy Wales, co-founder of Wikipedia. He said, yeah, exactly. So if he's on board, I'm going to declare victory on that one. How is journalism changing? In every way we can imagine, except I hope those principles, though I'm kind of worried about that. But one of the things we're doing is we stop pretending we know everything and that you're getting the news. That insulting line at the top of the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. Come on, it's all the news that fits. And there's lots of news that's fit to print that's not in there. But that's one of the things we can do is help people find the good stuff. That's a great role for journalists. We do that we do it in any things we do in how we do our work. There's aggregation and curation, new techniques. If you tried Flipboard, a wonderful mobile app, there's aggregation and curation in ways that are starting to be played with and that are pretty fascinating. Andy Carvin from NPR does this Twitter feed based on stuff he's finding from the Middle East, and he's pretty careful as saying this is verified, this isn't, and on and on. You get a sense of people he trusts and who they trust. Obviously, Google News is aggregation, and it's a perfectly good tool to use. It's not the end of news. Aggregation is, in particular, about pointing to stuff you don't do. And this is often brought on a newspaper in Stockholm that has a blog portal that they create. Basically, they look for every blog of any quality in Sweden and say, we're celebrating this alternate universe of media and showing it to you. And they are not saying that they're alone in the media universe. They're saying there's lots of others and they want you to find them. We can ask people in the conversation mode to help us do our work. A Florida newspaper did that a few years ago and got fabulous results from the community that knew a lot about this issue and was feeding them information in an organized way. The Guardian's been doing this routinely, maybe more advanced on it than most. ProPublica is right up there. The Guardian, in an expense account scandal with Parliament, they basically posted everything they had on the internet, said, help us find the good stuff to their audience. And people were going through the documents and finding some good stuff. The Guardian, I don't